In this episode, we will deal with the second phase of the constitutional negotiations in a new body that was called the National Negotiating Forum. The whole idea of CODESA had really been damaged by the manner in which it disintegrated after CODESA II. So this was a new negotiating process, but it was building on the foundations that had been laid at CODESA I and II, the core agreements that were also ratified at the Record of Understanding on the 26th of September 1992. So the negotiations began again in March 1993. They were very businesslike. The process was very professional. The various delegations had the assistance of constitutional experts who were able to assist with the actual constitution writing process. But then, a month or so after the negotiations resumed, at Easter time, on the 10th of April, South Africa received the shocking news that Chris Hani had been assassinated. He was the charismatic leader of the Communist Party. He was expected to play a major role in the future South Africa. He was killed, he was shot down by a white man. FW de Klerk was on holiday at that time over the Easter weekend, and he got the news that this had happened. FW de Klerk, what was your reaction? What did you do?
I was absolutely shocked. I immediately realized that this had the potential to overthrow everything which has been done. That South Africa could go up in flames. That the Leipzig option could become a reality. I was at lunch. We were at a family reunion in the little town of Steynsburg in the Free State, Northern Cape. I got a call that I have to call my Director General, Dave Steward. He broke the news to me. We immediately decided to issue a statement, of course, giving our condolences, giving assurances that the murderer will be found and that everything will be put at the police's disposal to solve this murder, to bring the guilty persons to book, and to take firm and far-reaching action. But I and you, Dave, realized that that would not be enough. I could go on television, which was difficult from where I was in the middle of nowhere, or we could consider another alternative. And I felt the right alternative was we must ask Mandela to take the lead on this one and go on television to calm his people. Because it is from the ANC supporters that the violent reaction might come. He acceded to the request and in a very statesmanlike manner made an appeal on TV on his people to remain calm. He stressed the fact that by then Janus Wallus have been arrested already because a white Afrikaner woman took down his car's registration number and provided it to the police. He deracialized the attack in that way, the assassination. And he initially succeeded in bringing calm and restoring calm to the situation. Some people say this was a moment when he really took over as president. I don't want to comment on that. It was my decision to ask him to take the lead instead of me going on TV initially. So, having taken those steps, I of course immediately hastened back to my office, and we had to deal with what was to follow.
And what followed was, in fact, quite widespread unrest throughout the country, which was actually fanned again by the ANC. There was a huge get-together at Hani's funeral, and the same Nelson Mandela, who'd made these conciliatory remarks on the day of the assassination, was throwing gasoline on the fire with very, very aggressive language, very aggressive speeches. Was this just politics on his part? What was the government's reaction to that?
Well, we couldn't control what they do or say. Of course, our reaction was one of entering into an argument about it, saying this is unfair, to try and once again accuse the government or the security forces of being on the wrong side of the law in this, and that it was they who created the atmosphere for this to take place. There's always been a risk from radicals on the right and radicals on the left of getting out of hand, as they did in the Transkei, when they did rolling mass action, when so many ANC people were killed. The assassination was the result of far-right extremism. So there were always this risk of extremists on the left and extremists on the right, trying to upset the process, trying to sabotage the negotiations, trying to create an atmosphere of violence and destruction. I was very disappointed in the fact that Mr. Mandela didn't carry on being the statesman on this issue, and that he did fan the flames by his speeches. And the negotiations were under threat.
But the dust settled. The negotiations continued at the National Negotiation Forum, and they made progress. And things were going quite well until another episode. On the 25th of June, the AWB crashed through the walls of the World Trade Center in Johannesburg, where these negotiations were taking place. This was right-wing extremists. They were wearing their sort of khaki uniforms. They disrupted the meeting. Delegates had to go and hide in offices while they took over the proceedings. It seemed as though extremism was once again threatening the whole basis of the negotiations. Again, what was your reaction to that?
Well, my reaction was not to blame Mr. Mandela and the ANC for creating an atmosphere which made that possible. My reaction to that was one of taking firm action immediately, of mobilizing security forces to a sufficient extent to bring law and order, to restore the safety and security of the negotiation forum and the negotiators themselves, and to ask for full police investigation and to have people prosecuted where there's evidence that they were guilty of whatever crimes they committed, because crimes were committed.
Now the AWB, the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, and Eugene ter Blanche, who was a very charismatic figure, they received an awful lot of TV coverage internationally, almost as though they represented a major faction in the political equation. But what was your view of the AWB and of Eugene ter Blanche?
The AWB was a militant organization without any real principles. They were opportunistic. They were extremely dangerous. They mobilized a group of people who were dangerous as individuals, but therefore also very dangerous as a group. So I regarded them as a danger to South Africa and to security in South Africa, and asked the security forces to keep a very close eye on them and to ensure that if we can take steps against them, within the law we should take such steps.
But then, once again, the dust settled, the negotiations continued, the negotiations made progress, and in August, you and Nelson Mandela were invited to visit the United States to receive the Philadelphia Peace Prize. You arrived in the United States and you had a meeting with, your first meeting with President Bill Clinton at the White House. What was your impression of President Clinton?
He was a very likable man. He was taller and more gangly than I expected him to be. He had with him Al Gore and a few others. And he was extremely friendly and very inquisitive about what was going on. They brought across to me a picture of a presidency of the United States, which was fully supportive of what we've been trying to achieve in South Africa, encouraged us, promised assistance wherever assistance might be needed. And it was a very positive and constructive meeting. Then there was a change in program. I think there was an arrangement that Mandela would then arrive and that would be a photo opportunity between the President and the Vice President of the United States, with me and Mandela present. But suddenly I was hurried out of the White House through a different route. And then Mandela arrived. So I had to face the photographers and the media alone when I exited from the White House. And then Mandela, of course, did the same when he left.
And I think you had a little bit of a confrontation with Mandela at that time too, because you both had to address this enormous audience in Philadelphia, and both of you made speeches. Your speech received more applause than his did, and I don't think that made him very happy. Later on in the press conference that he addressed, he again attacked you. Was this a dimension of your relationship? Were you competing? How was the relationship developing on a personal basis?
Unfortunately, a pattern did develop, where when he and I both appeared at the same press conference, there would be handshakes and smiles and sort of a bonhomie. But then when there's an ANC press conference, or a Mandela press conference, he would suddenly, out of the blue, attack me about some or other issue in South Africa. An issue not related to the event around which the press conferences were held. I remember on one occasion, whether it was at the Nobel Peace Prize function or whether it was at the American one, he attacked me because I put my foot down on who would become the chairman of the SABC, because they negotiated a quiet takeover of the SABC. I prevented it, I thwarted it. And he attacked me vehemently in public about this. So it was an unfortunate pattern that he would take swipes. I can't explain why he did it. Whether he was irritated by the fact that I was getting almost as much publicity as he was getting, that I was being recognized as one of the two major role players, and that the media and the public and so on really looked at the two of us as being a team rather than as individuals.
You returned to South Africa, and the next crisis that arose came from the Transkei. Although negotiations had commenced, one of the parties, the PAC, boycotted them and decided to continue with its armed struggle. And from bases inside Transkei, its armed wing, APLA, launched raid after raid against basically white targets in South Africa. And the crisis, the crunch came on the 25th of July when APLA gunmen burst into a church in Cape Town and machine-gunned 12 people who were killed, and many, many more were injured. You had negotiations with Holomisa, the leader of the Transkei. You'd talked to him about this. You'd asked him to stop any action from his territory that would threaten South Africa. What was his reaction, and what was the outcome of those efforts of yours to get the leader of the Transkei, Holomisa, to stop these actions?
Well, I recall that he came down to see me in Cape Town at my behest, that we had a very long meeting in which I really took him to task on the fact that he was offering room and space for the PAC to operate from his country's borders. He first denied it. He was very difficult. He was very sullen. I remember Puk Botha having a real go at him, after which he became very silent. The meeting ended inconclusively. And then something happened. The Defence Force, together with the police and their ministers, came to me when I was back at the office in Pretoria and said that they have uncovered a safe house in the Transkei being used as a storage place for arms, and a safe house from which attacks were being planned and launched against South Africans in South Africa. Because the Transkei was independent in terms of South Africa's laws and recognized, we had to have the President's permission to undertake an operation into an independent country. So they asked my permission to clean up the safe house. The Defence Minister, as well as the Defence Chief of Staff, assured me that they had thoroughly watched this house and that they were absolutely sure of their facts. The police said they had from 2 other independent sources, from snitches in prison, confirmation of the existence of this house and the purposes for which it was used. And I was asked to give permission for an operation to go in and attack that house and clean it up. I was very reluctant, but the evidence was overwhelming. And APLA's activities was so shocking that something needed to be done. So I said yes. But I said it must be done with minimal violence. And it must be done with the prevention of deaths. It must be done with great sensitivity. What happened is the operation took place, and instead of finding APLA soldiers there were a few, I think 5 or so, youngsters sleeping there, and they were all killed. I was very upset about that. It militated against the orders I've given and the parameters I drew. And when I pressed for an explanation to the security forces, they said when they banged into the house, they were convinced that the youngsters were reaching for weapons, that their lives were under threat, and they shot. In the end, I remember that in the government of national unity, when I was deputy president, there was a claim for compensation from the families of those youngsters. I fully supported it, and it was a very sad episode during my presidency.
In the meantime, the constitutional negotiations were reaching their conclusion at Kempton Park, but there were a few outstanding matters that hadn't been resolved. And as had happened so often before, when there were crucial issues that had to be solved, it was left to you and Nelson Mandela. And there was a so-called six-pack of outstanding issues that related primarily to the rights and borders of provinces, the role of the courts in the future South Africa, but most crucially, the manner in which the proposed government of national unity would take decisions. Many of your supporters said that we should insist on a two-thirds majority. And this was now becoming one of the critical issues before final agreement could be reached on the Constitution. Can you tell us a little bit about those final talks?
Yes, the buck stopped with Mandela and me. So it was difficult issues which had to be settled. Mandela and I had quite a long meeting. It was conducted in a good spirit, in a solution-orientated approach. And with a little give and take here, we resolved all of them. On the issue of a two-thirds majority, I was personally convinced that we should work on a consensus basis rather than a voting basis. Cabinet government won't work with voting all the time about each and every issue. If a two-thirds majority was not in the hands of the ANC, it meant that the National Party members of Cabinet, together with Inkatha, would have had a veto. And that would have led to bad government and to tension and not a consensus-seeking spirit within the Cabinet. I regarded this government of national unity as a continuous negotiation process. We had to accept the result of the election. There was a majority party. But we could continue to negotiate from a relative position of strength in the Cabinet and in Cabinet meetings. So I opted, and we resolved, that decisions in Cabinet would be taken by consensus. We resolved the six-pack, and the negotiations could be concluded.
On the 21st of December 1992, the new interim constitution was adopted by the South African Parliament. Were you satisfied that it achieved the goals that you had set out on the 2nd of February when you started this process?
To me, the final result in drawing up the interim constitution was not fully satisfactory. There were elements in it which I didn't like. But I was convinced, and I'm still today convinced, that, broadly speaking, everything which we regarded as red lines were sufficiently accommodated in that constitution for us to accept it. We must remember it's a National Party-dominated parliament which accepted this legislation. On certain issues, we would have liked things to be clearer. We would have liked minority rights to be protected more effectively than we succeeded in negotiating. we would have liked a number of other things. I don't have time to go into all that now. But by and large, yes, we had a meeting, I remember, where we checked. This is what we initially stated. This is what we have. Is it a yes or a no? And on all the issues which we regarded as of fundamental importance, the result was we've succeeded sufficiently to go ahead. On some very unimportant issues, we lost. On some other issues, the ANC lost totally. But by and large, I think their position was the same. They did not achieve what they wanted to achieve, but they achieved sufficiently to say, yes, they could go ahead with it.
In the same month, December 1993, you and Nelson Mandela were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for the peace process that was now reaching its fulfillment. You went to Oslo, and on the 10th of December, you were presented with the prize. It was perhaps bittersweet because although this was recognition for the role that you had played, there was quite strong opposition to you from a crowd that assembled outside of the hotel in Oslo, and that was full of praise for Mandela, but wasn't full of praise for you. What was your feeling about the Nobel Peace Prize and the fact that it had been awarded to you and the circumstances under which you received it?
I highly appreciated the fact that the Nobel Peace Committee had the guts and the courage to also give it to me. They knew it wasn't a popular decision. Their country, Norway, has a long history of having been on the side of the ANC, of being at the forefront of anti-apartheid activities. But they had the courage to acknowledge that without what I represented in South African politics, not me as an individual, could not be ignored, that the initiatives we took, that the restraint which we showed at times, that the way in which we never let go and carried on with the negotiations, the fact that we were prepared to make some sacrifices, they had to acknowledge that. So I did not regard it from an egoistic point of view, I'm now a Nobel Prize winner. No. It was acceptance of the role that I, my party, and my supporters, and millions of reasonable South Africans supported, that was fully acknowledged. I don't think the ANC liked it, as did not the crowd outside on the square with their candles in the snow, did not like the fact that I was included.
That really brought the negotiation process to its climax and prepared the way for the elections that would be held on the 27th of April. But before those elections were held, there were going to be plenty more crises, and we will deal with those in the next episode.